Chapter 5. The Case of the Doubtful Dummy. Mr. Brown lowered his evening newspaper and glanced up at the dining room ceiling as a strange wailing sound, half human, half animal, rang out from somewhere overhead. "What on earth was that?" he asked. "It's only Paddington," replied Mrs. Brown soothingly. "I let him borrow Jonathan's old violin to play with. I expect he's got caught up in the strings again. It's a bit difficult with paws." "Jonathan's old violin?" repeated Mr. Brown. "Sounds more like someone putting a cat through a mangle." He gave a shiver as another banshee-like note echoed around the house. "Don't tell me he's taken up music now." I don't think so, Henry," replied Mrs. Brown vaguely. "He said it had something to do with his detective work." "Oh, Lord!" Mr. Brown gave a groan as he settled back in his armchair. "Well, I wish you would hurry up and solve something. Perhaps we shall have a bit of peace and quiet then." "At least it keeps him out of mischief," said Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Bird looked up from her knitting. "It all depends on what you mean by mischief," she said meaningly. "If you ask me, it's more eating than detecting. I caught him looking for clues in my larder this morning." The Browns' housekeeper tended to view most of Paddington's activities with suspicion, and his latest one was no exception. Indeed, when he had finally emerged from the larder, his face had worn an unusually guilty expression for someone who was supposed to be on the side of law and order. Paddington's interest in detective work had started several weeks earlier, when he'd had to spend some time in bed. Shortly after the fair, the fortune-teller's warning had come true, and he'd caught a cold. It had been a particularly nasty one, and for a while he'd been completely off marmalade sandwiches, always a sure sign that things were not as they should be, and when the worst was over, Mrs. Bird had insisted on his staying indoors for a few extra days, just to be on the safe side. With Jonathan and Judy back at school, Mrs. Brown had been hard put to keep him amused, and in desperation she lent him some of her husband's library books. Mr. Brown liked detective stories, and in no time at all, Paddington began to share his enthusiasm. Even though he was a slow reader, he managed to get through quite a number, and after some discussion with the local librarian, Mrs. Brown made arrangements for him to have his own ticket for a trial period. From that moment on, Paddington visited the library several times a week, and he soon became quite a familiar figure in the mystery section. One of his favourite characters was a private detective called Carlton Dale, partly because his books were on the bottom shelf and easy to get at, and partly because there seemed to be a never-ending supply. Mr. Dale solved many of his cases from the comfort of his own home, and, like Sherlock Holmes before him, he often soothed his nerves with the aid of a violin. In fact, he seemed to spend most of his time sitting up in bed playing selections from the Desert Song while baffled officials from Scotland Yard sought his advice on their latest unsolved case. Unaware of the disturbance he was causing downstairs, Paddington pushed the bow back and forth over his own instrument several times and then gloomily laid it down on his bedside table. He had to admit that the noise was far from soothing, particularly as he hadn't even got a case to work on. In the books, Carlton Dale was never short of cases. If it wasn't the milkman falling down dead on his doorstep, it was someone from the police knocking him up with some urgent problem or another. Peering out from the front room window early one morning, Paddington came to the conclusion that the Browns' milkman looked unusually healthy, and when he tried ringing up the local police station to see if they had any unsolved crimes, they were most unhelpful. Heaving a deep sigh, he turned his attention to a letter he'd just finished writing. It was addressed to Mr. Carlton Dale himself, and in it, Paddington had sought advice on how to look for cases. According to his books, Carlton Dale lived in a fashionable quarter of London, and Paddington felt sure he must be well known to the post office, particularly as he'd once solved the case of the missing mailbags for them. Carefully sealing the envelope, he inscribed Mr. Dale's name on the outside, donned his duffel coat and hat, and then made his way downstairs in order to borrow a stamp. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown anxiously, when she saw what he was up to. "Must it go tonight?" She lifted one of the curtains and peered into the gloom. "It's a thick fog, not fit for a dog to be out, let alone a bear. I think you'd better go, Henry." "Thank you very much," said Mr. Brown from behind his paper. "I've had quite enough fog for one night, driving home without posting bears' letters." "It's all right, Mrs. Brown," broke in Paddington hastily. "I'd rather do it myself, thank you." and before the others had a chance to open their mouths, it disappeared out of the dining room. To be truthful, Paddington didn't really want anyone else to see who he had been writing to, and he was in so much of a hurry to escape. It wasn't until the front door closed behind him that he began to have second thoughts on the matter. For if it had looked murky through the Browns' dining room window, it seemed doubly so now he was outside. Pulling the duffel coat hood over his hat, he wrapped a handkerchief round his nose in order to keep out the worst of the smog, and after taking a deep breath began edging his way carefully along Windsor Gardens towards the pillar box at the far end. Paddington had never been out in a really thick fog before, and it wasn't long before he made a strange discovery. The railings, which he'd been carefully keeping on his right, had suddenly disappeared, and although he must have trodden the same path countless times in the past, he hadn't the slightest idea where he was. Worse still, when he turned round in what he thought was a half-circle in order to retrace his steps, he walked headlong into a tree, which certainly hadn't been there on his way out. Paddington was a brave bear at heart, but he began to grow more and more anxious as he groped his way along, and not a single familiar landmark came into view. Even the roads were strangely silent, with only the occasional outline of an abandoned car or other vehicle to show they were there at all. And as time went by with no sign of any passer-by to advise him, he had to admit that he was well and truly lost. He tried calling out help several times, first fairly quietly and then in a much louder voice, but it had no effect at all. Indeed, for all the good it did, he might just as well have saved his breath. Lowering the handkerchief from his nose, Paddington felt under his hat, removed the marmalade sandwich he always kept there in case of an emergency, and was just about to sit down in order to consider his next move, when he gradually became aware of a faint glow somewhere ahead of him. Like a lighthouse beam to a lost mariner, the glimmer gave him fresh heart, and in no time at all he was making all haste in its direction. The light seemed to be coming from a building with a number of very large windows, and as he drew near, Paddington suddenly recognised it as a large department store he had visited many, many times in the past. How he'd got there he didn't know, for it lay in quite the opposite direction to the one he had expected. But having found his bearings at last, he felt sure it would be able to get home again simply by following a main road which ran near to Windsor Gardens. Indeed, even as he stood considering the matter, he distinctly caught the welcome sound of slow-moving traffic in the distance. There was a lady standing in one of the windows, peering out into the gloom, and he was about to tap on the glass and ask where the nearest bus stop was, when he suddenly stopped in his tracks. The marmalade sandwich poised halfway to his mouth, and all thoughts of returning home momentarily forgotten. Pulling the handkerchief over his face, Paddington stepped back a pace into the mist, and then watched with ever-growing astonishment as a man with a beard crept through a door at the back of the window and threw a white sheet over the lady. Before she had time to cry out, let alone put up any kind of a struggle, he picked her bodily up and then crept out again, closing the door behind him in what could only be described as an extremely furtive manner indeed. It was all over in a matter of seconds, and Paddington could hardly believe his eyes. It was the case of the miserable mummies all over again, only more so because he'd actually seen it happen with his own eyes. In the book of that name, Carlton Dale had solved a particularly dastardly crime to do with kidnapping, in which the unfortunate victims had been hypnotised and then left in a shop window disguised as dummies to await collection during the night. The likeness of the two stories was uncanny, even down to the fog and the man with the beard. Most of the crimes in Carlton Dale's casebook took place under the cover of thick fog, when the police were powerless to act, and a great many of them were committed by men with beards. Indeed, Carlton Dale himself seemed fascinated by beards of any sort, and he was forever pulling them off on the final page in order to unmask the true villain. Mr. Dale had solved the case of the miserable mummies by taking on a job in the store itself, and if Paddington had entertained any thoughts about reporting his strange experience to the police, they disappeared for good and all a moment later when he caught sight of a notice pasted to one of the shop windows near the main entrance. It said simply, "Vacancies, good prospects, own canteen, apply Miss Gloria, staff appointments." It was unusually late before Paddington finally turned out his bedside light that night, and even then he was much too excited to sleep. Once or twice he switched it back on again in order to make an entry on a large sheet of paper headed clues, and it needed several quite long sessions on his violin before he finally dropped off to sleep. Fortunately, the Browns were so thankful he'd arrived home safely after his long absence, they managed to turn a deaf ear, but on the last two occasions, Mr. Curry was heard to fling open his bedroom window and empty a jug of water into the garden below. And if the tone of his voice was anything to go by, any tomcat who happened to be passing at the time would have been well advised to turn back without delay. However, despite his late night, Paddington woke early next morning. When he drew his curtains, he was pleased to see the fog had almost cleared, and after a quick wash, followed by an even quicker breakfast, he got ready to depart again. "I do wish I could see into Paddington's mind," said Mrs. Brown, as the front door closed behind him. "I know something's going on. I can recognise the signs. Besides, it's bonfire night at the weekend, and there was a letter from Jonathan this morning asking him to see about the fireworks. He hasn't done a thing yet. It's most unusual."
"If you ask me," said Mrs. Bird, "it's a good job we can't see into that bear's mind. There's no knowing what we might find sometimes."
Despite her words, the Browns' housekeeper looked as if she could have liked to ask Paddington a few questions as well. But by that time, he was much too far away and busy with problems of his own. It took him some while to find the appointments office of the store where the mysterious goings-on had taken place the night before, and as he approached a lady sitting behind a desk at the far end of the room, a clock was already striking 10 somewhere in the distance. "Excuse me, Miss Gloria," he announced urgently. "I've come about the job in the window. I'd like to be taken on, please." The lady in charge of appointments appeared to have problems of her own, for she carried on writing.
"Are you an under £10,000 a year man?" she asked briefly.
Oh yes," said Paddington eagerly. "I'm a £1 a week bear."
"A £1 a week bear?"
Miss Gloria gave a start as she glanced up from her work.
I don't think you're quite what they're looking for," she began, breaking off as Paddington fixed her with a hard stare. "Have you tried the post office?" she asked, in a slightly more helpful tone. "Perhaps you could put your name down as a Christmas temp."
"A Christmas temp?" repeated Paddington hotly. "I don't want to work for the post office. I want to work for you. It's a matter of life and death."
"Oh, really?"
Miss Gloria's expression changed, and she began to look quite flustered.
How nice. I'd like to help you," she continued, patting her hair. "But I don't think I can put you behind a counter. You may have trouble seeing over the top, and after all, you are rather..."
Once again, her voice trailed away as she caught Paddington's gaze.
"I really don't think I can offer you anything in the way of a 4-figure job," she said unhappily, riffling through some cards.
"Have you a 3-figure one?" asked Paddington, hopefully. Miss Gloria paused and withdrew a card from the file.
"There is one here," she said, "and I suppose you could call it a 3-figure job. It's £5.50 a week, actually, and we do supply a free Macintosh."
"A free Macintosh?" repeated Paddington, becoming more and more surprised. "Isn't the job inside?"
"Well," said Miss Gloria uneasily, "it is, and it isn't. Most of you is undercover. You'd be in charge of our sandwich board, actually."
Paddington's eyes glistened. It seemed even better than he dared hope for. "Do I bring my own sandwiches?" he inquired, "or do you supply them?" Miss Gloria gave a shrill laugh.
"I'll give you a chit," she said hurriedly. "You better go down and see our Mr. Waters. He's in charge of the stores and he'll fit you out. That's it, if you want a job."
Oh, yes, please," said Paddington. He'd never been in charge of any sort of board before, let alone a sandwich one at £5.50 a week, and after thanking the lady very much for all her trouble, he hurried back downstairs as fast as he could. The storeman eyed Paddington gloomily as he examined the chit. "I suppose they has to take what they can these days," he said. "But I shouldn't go joining no pension scheme if I were you. I doubt if you'd last that long." Mr. Waters disappeared behind some metal racks for a moment or two, and when he returned he was staggering beneath a pile of what looked like old tables with advertisement slogans painted on them. "Try this on for size," he said, lifting the conglomeration over Paddington's head. "Have a walk up and down and get the feel of it." Paddington peered at the storeman over the top of his board as if in a trance. Far from needing to walk up and down, he knew just what it felt like without even moving.
"What do you think?" asked Mr. Waters. "I don't know as we have a smaller one."
Paddington took a deep breath. His hat had been pushed down over his head, his whiskers were ruffled, and to make matters worse, the straps were biting into his shoulders as if he was supporting a ton weight. He was about to tell the storeman exactly what he thought about sandwich boards in general, and the one belonging to the store in particular, when he suddenly froze, hardly able to believe his good fortune, for a new figure had come into view through the door, or rather not a new figure, but an all too familiar one with a beard. "Hello, Soapy!" The newcomer nodded towards the back of the store as he addressed Mr. Waters. "You've still got you-know-who, all right?" The storeman gave a wink.
"She hasn't moved, Mr. Adrian," he chuckled. "Snug as a bug in a rug. All right for the weekend, eh? No change of plans?"
The man with the beard nodded again. "There's a whole gang coming," he said. "Can't stop now. My turn to get the coffee this morning. All 23. Just thought I'd check on my way to the canteen." Paddington stood rooted to the spot as the voices died away. It hadn't occurred to him that he might have a gang to deal with. It was the case of the dozen desperados all over again, only with 11 extra members, and it took him some moments to digest this new piece of information.
"I has to look up now," said the storeman,
breaking into his thoughts as he came back into the room.
"It's coffee time. If you want my advice, you get a cuppa while you've got the chance. Thirsty work lugging sandwich boards about. The canteen's just along on your right. Follow Mr. Adrian. You can't miss it."
Mr. Waters was addressing the empty air, for Paddington was already clumping his way along the corridor in hot pursuit of his suspect. Regardless of the odd looks being cast in his direction, he pushed his way into the canteen past a row of startled onlookers and made his way along the front of the counter until he was right behind the man with the beard. Although Carlton Dale had never mentioned having to wear a sandwich board on any of his cases, Paddington was glad he hadn't stopped to remove it, for at least it gave him cover while he considered his next move. Peering over the top, he racked his brains as the man in front loaded a tray with cups and saucers, and then felt in a purse for some money. It was as the lady behind the cash register handed over the change and slammed the till shut that Paddington had a sudden flash of inspiration, for the sight of all the money reminded him of yet another of Mr. Dale's infamous cases, the affair of the forged florins, in which the criminal had been tracked down with the aid of fingerprints taken from the coins themselves. "Excuse me," he called, addressing the lady behind the counter. "Have you seen what's on the wall behind you?" As the cashier looked round, Paddington seized his opportunity. Reaching out from beneath the board, he hastily turned the cash register round until it was facing him and then pressed one of the buttons. He wasn't at all sure what happened next, for it was all over before he had the time to blink, let alone see inside the till. There was a bing as the drawer shut out, and a split second later a crash echoed and re-echoed around the canteen as 23 cups of coffee went flying in all directions. "Mr. Adrian! Mr. Adrian!" The lady behind the cash desk peered under the counter as a cry of mingled pain and astonishment came from somewhere underneath. "Are you all right?" "What a thing to happen!" she cried, turning to one of the assistants. "And only 2 days before bonfire night." "He's been to so much trouble and all," clucked someone else. "They say he's made a marvellous guy out from a dummy from one of the windows. Been keeping it down in the stores as a surprise."
"He did it!" shouted another assistant, pointing at Paddington. "The one with the whiskers behind that sandwich board. He did it on purpose."
"Knew he was up to no good as soon as he came in," cried a waitress. "He pushed me in my vanilla slices. He was in such a hurry."
"Help! Bandits!" shouted yet another voice, taking up the call. Immediately the whole canteen was in an uproar as attention suddenly switched from the unfortunate Mr. Adrian, who was still lying under the counter in a pool of brown liquid, and focused on the sandwich board. But Paddington was no longer inside it. Like Carlton Dale, at his most elusive, he had disappeared. He still hadn't had time to take in all that had been said, but of one thing he was perfectly certain. Any working out of the problem which remained was much better done in the quiet of number 32 Windsor Gardens rather than the store's canteen. "There's a funny case in tonight's paper," said Mr. Brown later that same evening. "Quite near here. Apparently they had some sort of to-do in that big store. 'Sandwich board runs amok in staff canteen,' he read. 'Bearded window dresser attacked by mystery coffee-throwing bandit.' What will people get up to next? Asked Mrs. Brown from behind her knitting. You're not safe anywhere these days. Mr. Brown tossed the paper onto the floor for the others to see. Sounds like a case for you, Paddington, he called jokingly. I bet you £5 you can't solve that one. Paddington, who had spent most of the evening busily writing notes in his scrapbook, nearly fell off the poof with astonishment. Would you really, Mr. Brown? He exclaimed excitedly. Yes, replied Mr. Brown, suddenly looking slightly less enthusiastic about the matter. That's what I said. There was a confident note in Paddington's voice he didn't entirely like the sound of, and he looked even more unhappy a moment or so later when Paddington cut a picture out of the paper and began pasting it alongside his notes. Don't tell me you've been working on the case already, he asked. Paddington nodded as he licked a gummed label to place onto the photograph of a coffee-stained Mr. Adrian being interviewed with his guy. He suddenly felt very much better about everything. Carlton Dale rarely received any sort of reward for solving his crimes, let alone £5, and, although he didn't think he could possibly make as good a guy as the one in the picture, he was quite certain Mr. Brown's money would go a long way towards it, and supply a goodly number of extra fireworks for Jonathan and Judy into the bargain. I've called it the case of the doubtful dummy, he announced importantly, clearing his throat as everyone gathered around to listen. It all began yesterday evening when I wrote to Carlton Dale.